Hello YouTube, and welcome to this new tier list video. If you've been following the channel for a while, you know that this is not my first time making one of these. I've already covered every single muscle group, each time ranking the best and worst exercises to target them. But I never took the time to compare these muscles in relation to one another. I never ranked them in order of importance, and that is a big oversight because while some muscles are super important because they'll make you automatically more aesthetic, others are not that relevant at all and they do nothing for you when it comes to actually looking more jacked. So today I'm going to rank each muscle group in 4 different tiers that I've created specifically for this video. Only 4 this time because 5 was way too much. And the 4 that I've created are ranked from DL to IUT, DL being the lowest tier, which stands for do you even lift? This is the tier that I've selected for muscles that are so unimportant for aesthetics that no matter how much you hypertrophy them or grow them, it will make almost no difference and people will still think that you are a professional ping pong player because your physique will be completely unimpressive. Then the next tier up is going to be called buff alright. That is the tier for muscles that are going to allow people to tell that you have a gym membership, but nothing crazy. You're not going to turn heads. Then we have the third tier that I called jacked God. And that is the tier for muscles that will leave no doubt in people's minds that you lift. If these muscles are big on you, people will take one look at your body and say, okay, that person is in a committed relationship with the iron. There is no confusion. And then you have the top tier. You have the S tier. You have the tier above jacked God. And what could be above jacked God? This is the tier that I called IUT. What does IUT stands for? IUT stands for, are you using this? And anyone who has been to a commercial gym long enough, who has built a big body, already knows why I named that tier that. It's because there is a point in your lifting journey and career where you are scientifically considered huge. And you know that because people in the gym start to ask you if they have your permission to use equipment that you're clearly not using. Let me give you an example. I'm at my commercial gym. I'm doing military presses with dumbbells. I am like maybe 10 feet away from a lat pull down machine. That lat pull down machine is clearly empty and I'm clearly not using it. But the dude who is going to come around to use that machine is going to stop and he's going to ask me, are you using this? Why? Because my body is now so big that it has claimed ownership of everything around it. You are now the de facto leader of the gym. And so times and times again, people will approach you to ask you, are you using this? This is why that tier is named that. The muscles in that tier are the most important because if you grow them, you are going to be jacked. So as you can guess, this is going to be a more laid back video because I'm essentially just going to give my subjective advice on aesthetics and which muscles are the most important for it. So don't hesitate to chime in the comments and tell me what your ranking would be. I'm interested to hear about all differences because at the end of the day, all of this is based on preferences. But to be clear, I'm not going to judge these muscles based on bodybuilding criteria. I'm not going to judge them based on how aesthetic they make you look on stage, flexing with oil on your body, because that is not relevant to your day-to-day existence. Instead, they're going to be ranked and judged based on how jacked they make you look in closes when you're relaxed, because that is what you are most of the day. I think that you don't walk around the streets like this unless you are a complete twat. And if before or after this video you want to access the more informative tier list that I've already made, you can find them all in the description. I've put them all there for you. And if you enjoy these tier lists, also consider supporting the channel on Ko-fi. It's the first link in the description. A pledge of just $3 a month is of great help to me because it allows me to keep making videos. And with this introduction out of the way, we can start with the tier list. So the first muscle group I'm going to be judging is the chest. And I'm going to place the chest in the jacked God tier. To me, the chest is essential because when you are wearing a shirt, that is what is going to fill it up because it's what's going to create that thickness from the front. So it's super important that you build that thickness, right? Having a well-defined chest with striations is nice and all, but if you don't have the mass to come with it, it doesn't do much for you in terms of day-to-day aesthetics. It also makes you look thick from the side because when you turn around, the pectoral muscle bulges. So it's supposed to bulge further than your stomach. That is actually a good criteria, I guess, to see if you're overweight or if you're fit or actually in shape. If your stomach protrudes further than your chest, you're doing something wrong. So it's a muscle group that absolutely cannot be ignored. Any gym bro knows that when you have a nice pec pump and you have that nice tight t-shirt around it that really outlines the outer of the pec, it looks absolutely tremendous. There's a reason why if you look at the muscles that are emphasized on superhero, usually the chest is the number one. It's not the arms. So Superman, Captain America, the number one thing that captures your attention is their chest. And a ton of very famous, very iconic bodybuilders also were iconic because of their chest. Arnold, for example, was chest first and biceps second. So that was for our first muscle group. But the chest, the part that I described right now, is mostly the outer portion of the chest. What about the upper chest? Some people will tell you that the upper chest should be in the IUT tier immediately because it is, for many people, the aesthetic muscle of the upper body. And this is the first controversial placement of this video. To me, it's not at all. I disagree, which is why I'm going to place upper chest in the buff all right tier, not the DL tier, because still having a nice upper chest is going to allow people to tell that you lift. But there are too many things that, in my opinion, just shoot that muscle group in the foot. The first being that it's mostly hidden. Unlike the chest, which even in a shirt, you can tell I have a big chest, the upper chest you don't see. Why? Because your lower chest protrudes. So there's slack on the upper portion of the shirt. It's not tight to my body. Unless you are going to wear something that is going to be extremely close to the skin, in which case, yeah, maybe the upper chest is going to be visible. Or if you wear a V-neck. But in my opinion, that is detrimental to the overall appeal of the muscle. Then there's also the fact that the type of people who obsess over upper chest development tend to also be the one who have no chest to speak of. So why do you waste your time trying to develop that part of the chest when the entirety of the chest is lacking? Most people don't have an upper chest weak point. They have just a chest weak point. And this connects to the fact that, and I know that many people don't know this, the upper chest is not a different muscle. Right? There are certain muscles that have several heads, like for example, the triceps has 3 heads, and yes, they all work together more or less in tricep movements and presses and isolation, but some of them, like the long head, have functions that separate them from the rest of the muscle and that can be isolated. The same is not really true for the upper chest. Your upper chest is your chest. There's no distinction. It's just different fibers. And yes, certain angles on presses and inclines and certain exercises with a squeeze are going to recruit that muscle more. But the pure chest isolation, upper chest isolation that I see so many people raving about doesn't really exist. And so if you find an exercise that builds the entirety of the chest, you are going to be mostly covered for upper chest. And you can then later on add exercises that emphasize it. But keep in mind also that the majority of the time when you see people with a good upper chest, it's not really that their upper chest is more developed. Instead, it's that they're very lean because the chest carries a lot of fat. But when your chest is lean and ripped and shredded, you see mad striations. And the ones that people love the most are actually not the upper chest at all. It's the separation between the upper chest and the lower portions of the pec. This is what shows. But if you're above 10, 11% body fat, you're simply not going to be able to show it. And the same goes with the flex. The upper chest is a flex-dependent muscle. You need to flex your chest together and squeeze it together to show these striations. And that you just don't do in everyday life unless you just really want people to think that you're a freak. Unlike your actual chest, because your actual chest, yeah, you can flex it like this, but even when you're resting, it's thick. It's right there. You don't have to actually do anything, and it does the job for you. So this is why, even though technically the upper chest is part of the V-taper big 3 to have a nice V-taper, I am putting it solo on the list. Then we have biceps. And to this one, you could think, okay, NH, I've been watching you. I know you are biased for buys, and you're absolutely correct, I am. But I'm trying to remain objective as possible in this tier list. So for this reason, I will be placing biceps in the jacked God tier, not the highest tier. Why? Because to me, biceps is a little bit like chest. Most people are going to develop them at some point or the other because it's the muscle you think about when you think about being jacked. And so the market value of biceps is devaluated by default. But there are a lot of good things to say about biceps, of course. So for example, if you want thicker arms, from the front in particular, you really want to develop your biceps because that is what is going to show. That's the muscle that is facing people. That being said, if you have sleeves, even if they're not super long like this, it hides the bicep because that nice bulge and the nice peak is going to be covered by the clothes. And so that is going to be detrimental, even though if you get them thick enough, you can flex through clothes. That is a possibility. But then again, it requires you to flex because the bicep is also a muscle that is super flex dependent. A lot of the time, when you see someone with an impressive bicep resting, when they flex, suddenly that bicep turns into a mountain. Why? Because that's the nature of the muscle. It's being pushed upwards when you flex it, but you are simply not flexing in everyday life because you're relaxed most of the time. Then there's also the issue of the overall thickness of the arm, and we'll talk about that later. But it's true that in terms of raw measurement and just visual thickness, the bicep contributes less than the tricep, and so I'm not going to place it super, super high. But at the end of the day also, it's true that when someone asks you, hey, do you lift? Or like someone asks you to flex, you're not going to flex your calves. You're not going to flex your fucking trapezius, although some people would. But I think that the majority of the population, you tell them, hey, flex for me, they're going to give you a nice double biceps, and that is going to be it. So this is the reason why for this placement. Then we have le second couteau. We have a muscle that many people forget even exists because it's a deep layer muscle. It's placed underneath the bicep muscle, and that is the brachialis. And the brachialis surrounds the entirety of the arm. I'm going to place the brachialis in the buff or right. Unfortunately, because in truth, the brachialis is the real MVP. It is what makes up the majority of the thickness of your arm in terms of the globality. The peak is dominated by the bicep, but understand that most people who have a very nice peak, it's not just that the two heads of the biceps are developed. It's also that the brachialis underneath is big, and so it pushes the muscle upward. The problem with that muscle in particular is that we want muscles to show. Right? So a muscle that is hidden underneath is not going to be super sexy. It's very lean dependent. It is possible to get a nice bulge and even a nice striation and a nice visual from your brachialis muscle, but that is going to require you to be actually quite lean, and most people are not going to be able to achieve that. However, it is still possible, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see with this lighting, but if you get enough of a development, you will be able to start seeing bulge here, even if you are not that lean. I'm not that lean at all. But this is a question that I hear many people ask. Hey, how do you add thickness to the outside of the arm? How do the arms look thicker from the side? Well, that is that. It's the brachialis. So for that reason, it cannot go in the do you even lift tier. It still has to be shown some respect. After this, we have the first muscle I'm going to be placing in the IUT tier, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. That is the forearms. Forearms are super underrated, and it is a true shame because they make or break your physique. When you see me standing here right now, right, in a shirt relaxed, what do you see? What jumps to you? Well, what you see is the only thing that protrudes, the only thing that is outside of my shirt. You see my forearms. Times and times again, I hear people say, oh, lifting natty is a waste of time because you look like you don't lift in clothes. First off, not true. You still look impressive, relaxed if you build mass. But then again, it's normal that you don't look as impressive as shirtless because people can see your fucking muscle. That being said, it's not true for the forearms. Your forearms are exposed all the time. This is the reason why we call them cleavage for men. If you ask girls one gesture, one motion they find sexy in a man, it's the action of rolling up your sleeves. Why? Because it reveals these thick forearms, if and only if they're thick. This is why I insist so much that you must isolate your forearms. On top of that, they're not very flex dominant at all. If I just sit there, right there, I'm not flexing my forearm and it's still big. Likewise, the forearm tends to have lower body fat than the rest of the body. So you're going to have nice vascular development in your forearm, even if you are fluffy, even if you have more mass on your frame. And all of this is super valuable for aesthetics. The same sort of goes for biceps. Some people are blessed with good bicep vascularity. Some are not, unfortunately, but forearms, I've yet to meet someone who carries all of their body fat on their forearms. If you train them, if you get a slight pump, they're going to get veiny, they're going to look juicy, they're going to look massive. But it's not just about the visual. The thing with good forearms, big forearms, is also that they work as a status symbol. Because since the majority of people don't isolate them, the majority of people have small forearms. So if you have big forearms, you stand out by default. And usually, you'll notice that if you meet a dude who has big forearms, he's one of two things. He's either someone who's been doing beast-like lifting for years and years and years without straps, and so the forearms grew by default, or he's someone who is smart, understands that he can isolate the function of the forearms, and he has hacked the system. Then we have another part of the forearm that, unfortunately for it, is not ranked as high at all, and that is the pronator muscle. So if you watch my forearm tier list, I have a section about the pronator, which is the muscle that is located inside your forearm here. The pronator is a very small muscle, and even when it is highly developed, like in arm wrestlers, it requires flex and a certain angle to be visible. So I'm going to place it in the do you even lift tier, because when you think aesthetic muscle to develop, you certainly do not think about your pronator. That being said, it looks cool as fuck in the right lighting and in the right pump angle. But when you flex your arm and the pronator is visible, the bicep is also visible, and so the muscle sadly gets dwarfed by the bicep, which is 10 times its size. But continuing with the muscles of the arms, we now have to talk about the triceps. So I separated the tricep between the lateral head and the long head, and to me the lateral head goes into the buff or right category. Because one, it's the smallest part of that muscle. If we don't take into account the medial head, that is just a continuation of the long head, that lateral part in most people, unless you have crazy gifted insertions, is going to be something that sits at the top of the arm that's not that massive at all. And so it doesn't add much thickness to the arm, and it doesn't add anything really interesting in terms of aesthetics. It's not the type of thing that is going to make or break your physique. And just like with the pronator, we also have the issue of the neighbor, because every single muscle competes with muscles in its vicinity. So for the triceps, it's going to be the long head. The long head is the big boss of the arm. It's the biggest portion of the muscle of the arm. And naturally, when you flex it from the side, what is going to take the breath away, what is going to attract the most attention, is going to be that long head. So the triceps lateral head sadly suffers. It's the little brother of the arm, which is also why the long head of the tricep has to go in the IUT tier. It's what is going to make your arm look freaky or not. I am in love with biceps, but I must recognize that unless you're actively flexing in a double bi, even if your bicep is huge, it doesn't do as much visually as a long head of the tricep, because even when you're resting and you're not flexing and you're not pumped, if you have that meat at the back of your arm, it looks crazy. Like, I know for me that when I look at dudes, a guy that to me has big arms is always going to be the guy that has that long portion of the tricep that is developed. Because if you're just standing there with arms by your side, it protrudes. It looks impressive regardless of the situation. And that even is mathematically correct because, as I said, it's the biggest portion of the arm, the one that hypertrophies the most, and therefore also the one that adds the most mass from every single angle. Because you can see the long head of the tricep from the front, because when you're resting, your lats press against it, and so it protrudes to the side like this. You also naturally see it from the back. When someone flexes from the front, you see it because it wraps underneath the arm. And I also believe, and this is personal, but it's one of the coolest muscle to flex because it looks insane, right? When you turn around and you hit that side pose and you press with your lats and that long head protrudes, it makes you look like a complete monster. When you're doing push-ups or a press, what do you look at? I know that for me, when I'm looking at the mirror and I'm doing like an incline press, what my eye is immediately attracted to is that long head, because I can see it. It's like sculpted, it's veiny, it gets pumped super easy, it carries very little body fat, and it also connects with the rest of the body. That's also the issue that I have with other muscles like the chest that tend to be standalone, right? They're by themselves. The long head of the tricep didn't just come alone, it has bodies. It connects with things like your lats. It connects with things like your rear delt. It connects with things like your shoulder. And if all of these parts are very developed, you're going to get that pit bull look. You know, when you watch a pit bull, when they like jump on the fence or they're eating and they're like on top of their food and you see them from the back and you see all of the musculature of the back of the arm that connects with the musculature of the shoulder and the musculature of the scapular belt, it looks absolutely impressive. And when a human is able to replicate that, it looks also cool as fuck. But enough about the arms, enough about the upper body, because you're going to end up thinking that the only thing that matters for aesthetics is the upper body, and it's not true. There are a lot of muscles in the lower part of your body that are just as important, if not more. Starting with the quads. The quads, to me, deserve to be placed in the jacked god tier. It is what is going to make the biggest difference when it comes to leg aesthetics, with or without pants. If you have big, juicy quads and you have pants that fit, people can tell that you lift through your pants. And that's super important because there is nothing more than seeing a dude with skinny legs. And this is not necessarily true where I live now because most people eat good and they tend to be physically active. But when I used to live in Paris, holy fuck. Most men, they look like they have polio. I mean, they walk around on these like tiny sticks. They look like birds. And I think to myself, well, there's absolutely no fucking way you're threatening. There's absolutely no fucking way you're going to intimidate anyone but a pigeon with legs like this because it just makes you look weak. But if you have big tree trunk quads, automatically you're going to look more powerful. And there's going to be no doubt in people's minds that you lift because it's a status symbol, right? There's a reason why people make fun of dudes who skip leg day. It's because they're not considered to be serious lifters. And while, of course, if you don't give a fuck about having big legs, it's your prerogative and it's your preference in terms of aesthetics. But understand that if you have a massive upper body with the legs to go with it, you look automatically much, much better. The aesthetics of the sweep, of that nice outer quad sweep, to me is unmatched. If you have a nice bodybuilding like set of trunks or shorts, you're going to look cool as fuck in summer. But it's not limited to shorts. If you are a guy and you lift and you have big legs, please invest in jeans that are athletic jeans that are tight to the body, that are elastic. It's going to be much more comfortable for you, but also it's going to show off your leg gains. Just make sure that you don't enter the extreme of focusing too much on the legs because, as I said, big legs look cool if and only if they match the upper body. But if they start to dwarf the upper body, they're going to make you look like a frog. And the frog physique, and it's a Frenchman telling you this, is really not one that you want to go for. But quads themselves are not enough. For fitness, there is a muscle group that, yes, is going to be trained through most squat exercises that still requires our attention, and that is the adductors. I'm going to place the adductors in the buff all right category because even though they also do happen to be the real MVP when it comes to thickness, because just like the Brachialis, they're going to be the ones to add all of that size around the leg because they are connected both to the quads and the hamstrings, so they go around the entirety of the limb. It also must be said that when you think about aesthetic muscles, you don't think adductors. A lot of people actually don't want to grow their adductors because they think that it ruins your leg aesthetics. I personally don't agree, but it's true that if you carry a lot of fat in the area, it can end up looking goofy if it dwarfs the rest of the leg. On top of that, it can rub, we call it chub rub, and that's very uncomfortable. This is only if you let yourself go. Personally, I've noticed that I used to have that when I was fat, and now that I'm back at a leg measurement that's bigger than when I used to be 240, I don't have none of that. So I think it was mostly because back then it was a lot of just fat tissue, and now that it's muscle, it's better. So don't be afraid of isolating that muscle. As long as you just improve its size via muscle mass, you should be absolutely fine. But that's just my personal experience. And continuing with muscles of the upper leg that I separate from the vastus lateralis and the rectus femoris, we also have to discuss VMO. So the VMO technically is part of the quads. It's a continuation of a vastus muscle. I think it's the vastus medialis. But since a lot of people hyper-focus on it as the aesthetic muscle of the leg, I wanted to take it aside and discuss it. Because in my opinion, it isn't at all. It's just like with the upper chest. It's an obsession I see a lot with skinny dudes who don't want to get too massive, or they don't want to get too buff or too bulky, whatever the fuck that means. I'm going to place the VMO muscle in the buff or right. Because if I see a dude who has very developed VMOs and nothing else, he has no quad sweep, he has no adductors, I'm not going to be impressed by the guy. Like, you have athletic looking legs, good for you, but in terms of what would make you look jacked and look more intimidating, that just doesn't do anything for me personally. But it is true that this muscle in particular, when striated, is very pretty. But the only way to get it highly striated is to be super lean, which is going to be detrimental for the rest of the mass of the body. So it's really a lose-lose situation in that case. And that connects again with what I said about the upper chest. It's what I call the small guy syndrome. There are muscles connected to that syndrome where they will go out of their way to sacrifice overall mass to preserve the aesthetic of one muscle group, which is just going to be detrimental because they end up just looking skinny. Don't even get me started on people who believe that if you grow anything but your VMO, you're going to have feminine legs. Like having tree trunk legs is somehow feminine. I don't know in what world these people live, but I'm certain that I'm not going to spend my next vacations there. And talking about feminine muscles, we have another one on the list that is, in my opinion, not controversial at all, and yet some people don't want to grow it at all, and that is their glutes. I don't want to hear any discussion. The glutes are going to go in the IUT tier immediately. First and foremost because it is the most 3D muscle in the entire body. You cannot contradict this. There's not a single other muscle that is more swept than your glutes because of their insertions, because of the way the muscle is shaped. And since in bodybuilding, that matters a lot, in aesthetics, that matters a lot because the visual of the 3D, the bubble and the sweep is extremely appealing. Why would you not work the muscle that was literally built to look like this? And I know some people argue that it's because, it takes away from your physique. I've personally never, in my entire life, seen a natural bodybuilder whose glute size took away from his body or from the rest of his muscles. For the simple reason that unless you're a chick, your glutes shouldn't be visible from the front. So in front poses, it doesn't take away from anything. When you turn around, the glutes protrude forward, so they add that 3D effect, but they will never take away from the definition of the back. And then when you turn to the side, that's when they become really important because they add a shit ton of thickness. It makes you look automatically better. And that's for bodybuilding. What about real life? Well, what muscle is the most visible on your body when you're walking around with clothes? It's your glutes, right? I talked about the forearms previously. The forearms is the muscle of the upper body that gets the most visibility. The glutes also do, but unlike the forearms, you don't have to walk around with your cheeks in the open. If you have big glutes, any level of pants is still going to show that you have big glutes. So there's going to be no doubt in people's mind that you lift. It's also not lean dependent at all. You can have a nice, comfortable body fat percentage and you'll still have a fat ass. If anything, the more fat you carry, the fatter your ass is going to be, which I know that it's beating a dead horse at this point, but it must be said, is something that girls tend to really like. When girls discuss what they like in a man and they talk about physical attributes, things like the chest, things like the arms might be less important than you think. A nice pair of glutes is going to get you a lot of attention, especially because if you think about it for a second, girls can look at it from the back. So they don't have to worry about you catching them looking. They can look at your ass, which is exactly the reason why you also like to look at the asses of girls, you little pervert. But I don't blame you, I'm the exact same. So that was for glutes, right? Top tier, undisputed. If you're the type of person who's afraid of, my ass is going to get too big, impossible, don't worry about it. And the same goes for the next muscle on the list, but for a different reason. It's because that muscle is entirely invisible. That is the psoas. It's the muscle that runs through your hips and around your pelvis. You just don't see it. So no matter how much you grow it, it's not going to change much, but it's absolutely essential for performance and for overall health. So it's one of these sleeper muscles that for aesthetics do nothing. I'm going to place it in the do you even lift tier. I think personally that if you are a bodybuilder or just a fitness enthusiast and you do your hip hinges and your squats and like your leg isolation unilaterally, you are going to get covered in this. Then apparently movements of the core and like rotations of the hips, things like hip swings can also help. All of this is something that you're going to have to experience, but understand it's going to have no incidence on your aesthetics, which is something that many people believe also applies to the next muscle on the list, and that is your erectors. And I personally couldn't disagree more. The erectors, yes, are extremely important for health and for strength and mobility, but they're also vital for aesthetics. And so I'm going to put some respect on them by placing them in the jacked god tier. Here's the deal with the erectors. Yes, if you get super lean or if you have good body fat distribution, you're going to get a Christmas tree, which looks very cool. But that doesn't mean that the muscle is lean dependent. Because if you are higher body fat or even wearing clothes, these erectors, if developed enough, will literally run around your spine and they will protrude. So they will add a shit ton of thickness to your entire body and they will be visible. If right now I won't do it, if I turn around and I pull on my shirt and I show you the back of my body, you'll see that my back is not straight. My back is round. Why? Because my erectors protrude, because I have a lot of body fat and because I train it. You can immediately tell who is doing their hip hinges and who isn't by the thickness of their erectors. Having a nice V-taper, having nice traps, all of that is very cool. But if you turn around and you don't have these erectors developed, you're not going to look jacked. And talking about posture chain exercises, we're going to continue with the hamstrings that I'm going to place in the buff or right category. So the hamstrings is also a form of status symbol, just like with the erectors. If you have developed hamstrings, most likely it means that you're lifting some heavy weight in front of you, that you're doing some heavy pulls, some heavy good mornings. So if you want horse legs, the total package, you're going to have to target them. You know, when we talk about horse legs, it's not just the quads. It's the fact that when you turn around, it literally looks like a horse leg. And the hamstring plays a big role because they add that slab of meat at the back of your lower limbs. The issue I have with them is that it's also a muscle that tends to be overshadowed by clothes because depending on what you're wearing, a lot of the time the eye is going to be attracted by the glutes, and so the hamstring down there is not going to be that visible. On the side, it's a different story because they, if they're developed, are going to sweep. So there's going to be some more visibility there, but it's never going to be able to compete with the quads because unlike the quads, the hamstrings are only really visible from the back. Whereas the quads, if the outer portion of the quad is developed, it can be seen from the back and from the front. I understand that this also is highly dependent on where you're coming from. I've heard strength athletes say that if they show up to a competition and they see a guy with big hamstrings, that's the guy they're going to look out for because this guy is most likely going to be a big threat. But in terms of judging another guy's body or looks, I personally have never been mesmerized by someone's hamstrings. So that's why they're placed so low. However, I've been mesmerized by some guys' traps, which is why the traps are going to go in the IUT tier. That should be a no-brainer when you see dudes with traps up to their ears. You're going to ask them if they're using that piece of equipment just to be safe. Just to make sure they don't deadlift you from the ground. Just to be sure that you don't become their next protein snack. And it's not limited to upper traps, you know. We have a tendency to, of course, hyper-focus on this because it's the most visible. It's the one that we associate with being yoked. But the middle and the lower portions of the traps are just as important. Because if you develop them enough, they will pop, right? We keep talking about the 3D effect. What muscle of the upper back is the most 3D? From the back, right, when you're not looking at someone from the side, it's going to be the traps. And I say that shit even from the side. When I stand to the side, my traps protrude, right? They look like ridges. That is cool as fuck. It looks cool as fuck. And the beautiful thing is that when you're wearing a shirt, that thickness doesn't disappear. Because now the shirt is going to fall differently on your back. It's going to espouse all of these ridges, all of these nice little caves and crevices and mountains that you have on your upper back. Which is what people tend to associate with a masculine looking back. It's not just about the width. If you have all of the width in the wood, but you're as thin as a piece of paper, it's not going to impress anyone. You have to have that meat, and that meat is going to be built through trap development and rhomboid development. And unlike what some people might think, no, developing your traps isn't going to make you look more narrow. It's not going to make you look shorter. I know that this was a big topic of discussion. I think Vince Gironda was the one who used to tell people, bodybuilders back in the days, to not grow their traps too much because it was going to be detrimental. I personally disagree. The only thing it's going to do to grow your traps is it's going to add thickness to the entirety of the upper back, and you cannot go wrong with more thickness. Plus, as I said, if you have jacked upper traps and they show through shirts or when you're wearing a tank, who's going to question whether you lift or not? The question that people are going to ask themselves is this guy on steroids? That's what people are going to think, because that's the muscle that we tend to associate with being enhanced. So if you want to be naturally enhanced, pun intended, Alex, then yeah, traps is the muscle that you want to focus on. Then we have the lats. So I understand that the lats, when it comes to like pure aesthetics, is high up there because we glorify the lats, we glorify the V-taper. And I think that all of that is fine, but to me, the lats cannot be placed in the top tier. I'm going to place them in the jacked God tier because they're still vital, and I'm going to explain to you my reasoning and why. So the problem with the lats to me is that they are placed around other muscle groups that just do the job better. So if you look at, for example, what is going to look the coolest in terms of definition from the back, it's going to be the erectors. If you want to see what is going to add the most thickness, the most meat, and the most 3D effect, it's going to be the upper traps. The lats are caught between these two muscles. And yes, they're going to do something for you that is super important, and that is that width, that flaring out of the lats that looks absolutely stupendous. But also believe that a back that only has lats and nothing else is not going to be as impressive as a back that only has traps and nothing else. So for that reason, I'm putting it down, like it's taken down a peg. But I don't want you to think that you should therefore ignore the lats, because for the same reason, if you have a back that is solely constituted of trap development and like teres major and minor, and you don't have that outer portion, it's going to look fairly weird because it's going to make you look like a T. So you'll have a T shape and a T taper instead of a V taper. And since the V taper is the aesthetic look, I also absolutely agree that the lats are the aesthetic muscle in that regard, much more, of course, than the upper chest. Also, when you have nice lats and they flare out, it's going to make your shirts look different and fall differently. Unless, of course, you're wearing like a double XL like I do. But if you're someone who enjoys having shirts close to the body, they're going to follow the shape of the lats, and that looks super cool. And again, it makes your V-taper look even more impressive. And then there's also the trick of the eye that a lot of people utilize once they build a lot of lats mass. Once the lats are big enough, you can use them to press underneath the arm so that you can push the portion of the tricep, the long head of the tricep outside, so as to accentuate the sweep even more. So the lats are, in a sense, double teaming your physique because they allow the long head of the tricep to be even more aesthetic and to look even bigger, which is something that I want to highlight here because many people have a tendency to think that the lats can only be width. And this comes with a lot of bullshit, in my opinion, of people who say, well, this exercise is for width. A good exercise for lats will build thickness of the muscle, which will increase your width. That's it. Some movements might be better for the lower portion of the lats that is going to, again, accentuate the flare. But if you have good lat development and you turn around, you should see your lat protrude. They should still be visible from the side, even if you are wearing a shirt. That is when you know that you're actually growing your lats and you're not just a skinny dude who looks like a kite. And talking about skinny dudes, we now have the most controversial placement of this entire playlist. And I can already read the angry comments from people who are going to tell me I'm a fucking idiot. But after spending a lot of time thinking about it, I came to the conclusion that the abs have to be placed in the do you even lift tier. And I know it's surprising because I've been telling you guys to isolate your abs. I've been telling you guys that if you don't have a nice six-pack or a nice core, it's going to ruin your entire physique. And I stand by this. But it only really applies when you're shirtless. If you think about it, if you take two dudes, one has big traps, the other has no traps, and they both wear a shirt, you will automatically be able to tell the one that's the most jacked because the traps show. Likewise, a guy who has small arms, a guy with no arms. The guy with no arms is going to look smaller. But if you look at the abs, can you tell the difference in public between people who have a six-pack and people who don't, unlike the person is fat? No, because the muscle is not designed for that. The abs is a beach muscle. It's a show muscle. 99% of the time, it's not visible. And so it cannot compete with these other muscles on the group because it doesn't add the thickness that we want, that we are looking after for this tier list. It's also a muscle that is super lean dependent. It is possible to have a six-pack and be high body fat. I'm the proof of that, and many bodybuilders are showing that as well. But if you don't have that mass, some other muscle groups are going to do strictly better. Like shoulders, yeah, even if you're not like super massive or super lean, you'll still have some nice rounded shoulders. But for the abs, it might require you to go way deep in the body fat percentage range, which connects back again to the small guy syndrome I was discussed, because the abs is the muscle that is the most connected with this curse. How many young men are just unwilling to bulk, unwilling to gain weight, unwilling to put on mass because they're clinging to their abs? But they don't understand that the abs is an addition, right? If you have a nice muscular physique and a six-pack, it looks tremendous. But if you just have a six-pack, no one gives a fuck. Unless you're 14, no one is going to be impressed by your shitty, skinny six-pack because it is simply not impressive. So even if you're shirtless and you just have a six-pack, it's not going to do shit for you, which is why I think that it absolutely belongs in the do you even lift tier. And it's gotten to the point that I think many bodybuilders agree with me because abs have become an anti-status symbol, where I'm seeing bodybuilders who go out of their way to not isolate their abs, as in to show, hey, I'm serious about lifting and I'm not just some jackass who wants to like be attractive to girls at the beach. That also is a problem, of course, because I've seen natural bodybuilders who have everything developed and then you look at their core and it's like flat. So they're not fat, thank God, but there's nothing there. There's no definition. It's like, what the fuck, buddy? Okay, sure, the muscle is not that important to look jacked, but still, please spend some time developing it. That is to say, do not take displacement as an excuse to not train your abs. Please keep training your abs. And that also goes for the obliques. The obliques that I'm actually going to be placing above the abs. They're going to go in the buff or right category because if we're talking thickness, if we're talking shaping of the body visible through clothes, the obliques do much more than the abdominal wall for the simple reason that they encompass the entire torso. That's the thing that many people don't seem to know about it. I know that many people think that the obliques is just located here on top of your love handles or rather underneath your love handles. That's not the case. Every single muscle that you see here before the serratus and the rib cage, that is your obliques. So if you develop them, it's going to make your core look much, much better. But on top of that, it might actually make it look better in closes because it's going to make it look tighter. There's this idea that growing your obliques is going to grow your waist. Waist size is genetic. I know what I'm talking about. I have a big ass waist and I can tell you that working the obliques is the best thing I've ever done because it has made my core look better. If you have a big core, you have a big core body. People are going to look at it. Might as well make it look pretty. And if you have a tiny core, sure, you can skip oblique isolation if you want to, but understand that if you did isolate your obliques, you wouldn't wake up one day with like two big mounts on each side of the body. It's simply not how the muscle works. And the reason why I also place it above the abs is because the abs, yes, connect the entirety of the body, but they're also a standalone muscle. Whereas if you look at the obliques connect to stuff like your serratus, they connect to stuff like your lats. And so if you want a complete aesthetic package, you really want to be working that muscle. And it's nice that I just name dropped serratus because it's the name muscle on the list. And the serratus to me is the most important of the core muscle when it comes to raw aesthetics, which is why it's going into the jacked god category. And that might be a bit surprising because I don't know many people who target their serratus in priority. And that's fine because a lot of vertical pressing and vertical pulling is going to work that muscle. A lot of ab isolation movements that you don't really think are for serratus are going to work that muscle. And if you are pullover pilled and you do your pullovers, you also are directly targeting your serratus. So you're good in that regard, which is quite important because in my opinion, the serratus is the most underrated muscle for aesthetics in the entire body. One, because it is vital for a complete V-taper. People tend to think that V-taper is shoulders, lats, upper chest. I personally say it's shoulders, lats, serratus, because what is going to connect the lats to the shoulders underneath the ribcage is your serratus muscle. And so if you don't develop it, you're going to make your V-taper look worse. And that's not just shirtless. It also goes for if you're wearing a shirt, because a serratus muscle is not just about definition. It can get thicker. And when it gets thicker, what happens? Well, it adds up to the triangle of the V-taper. It adds up to the connection of the lat to the upper arm. And that can make or break your V-taper, which is why when I push pullovers, I insist on the fact that it targets your serratus because it expands the rib cage. But still, I'm not going to place it in the top tier because it's never going to be something that is going to make or break a physique. However, one muscle group that if you have is going to just guarantee and certify that you are going to be considered jacked by the majority of the population is the shoulders. And I say it as someone whose goal physique does not include shoulders, or at least didn't for a long time. But it doesn't stop me from accepting that objectively, shoulders are the bodybuilding muscle. If you have big shoulders, people will think, oh yeah, that guy is either a bodybuilder or he's a strongman. Because you don't just get big shoulders by accident, right? You have to have strong vertical presses, horizontal presses, and you have to isolate it for the majority of the natural population to get them to grow. And going back to the topic of the V-taper, the shoulders are essential for the V-taper because they're going to add the most width to your entire physique, which is sort of the nature of the muscle. If you look at a human body, a male body, when I'm standing there, what are the extremities? They're here. And the extremities are comprised of the shoulders. So the more the shoulder muscle grows, and the more it's going to be pushing your physique outward, which is why on top of V-taper discussion, I think it's important that we mention the shelf muscles. The shelf muscles are everything that you see here in a line below my neck. So it will be shoulders, front delts, it will be traps, and it will be upper chest. These muscles, I find, when developed, really give you the bodybuilder look. Then there's the obvious status symbol of growing big delts as a natural lifter, because again, it means that you know your shit, that your training routine is programmed properly because you're targeting each head of the shoulder, right? Even though it's possible to grow your front delt with only presses, we all know that something like the real head of the shoulder, the real delt, is a completely different beast. But I place all heads of the shoulders in the IUT tier because to me they're all equally as important. The front delt for that thickness from the front, the real delt for the coconut look and the sweep, and the real delt because it adds thickness from the back and also it looks cool as fuck. If you have a developed real delt and you flex it, you know it takes this alien shape which can connect to the long head of the tricep. And you'll see that all of the muscles in the top tier, they share a relationship with one another, right? If you flex your shoulder and you have that sweep, it's going to connect with the long head. It's going to make your arm look like a balloon, and to me, that looks tremendous. Then there's also the added benefit of the shoulder being that it's not lean dependent, because with shoulders, you cannot lose. If you're high body fat, they're going to be bigger and they're going to look rounder. And if you're leaner, they're going to be striated. So either way, they're going to look cool as fuck. Then, regardless of your choice of apparatus and clothes, it's still going to look cool. If you have a t-shirt, it's going to make you look wider and bigger. And if you wear a tank top, people are going to be able to bask in the glory of your 3D delts. I think we all agree that shoulders are super important. And there will be no controversy for the next entry in the do you even lift tier, which is the muscles of the hands. Because by a show of hands, how many of you guys isolate these muscles? How many of you guys think, oh dude, if only I could have a more jacked hand, then my dream would come true? Zero, no one gives a fuck. So in the lower tier you go. Now understand that this is made perfectly logical by the fact that the muscles of the hands are extremely small. And yet there are a lot of muscles in your hands. Like if you look at the adductor pollicis, it's made up of 2 heads plus another one that runs through them. But they're so tiny that it won't make much of a difference. You know, the only thing I can think of when I think of hand muscle is the fact that this portion here underneath the thumb looks super, super juicy. I think that if I ever get sent to a desert island with survivors, this is the part I'm going to eat first. So if you ever end up on a plane with me and we crash, keep that in mind because that's the part I'm going to go for first. And the reason why I wanted to put that in the list is not just for the joke. It's because I'm starting to see more and more people trying to grow their hands. It's this new gimmick. You can pump up your hands if you want. It's going to look more impressive for like a picture for like 15 minutes, but after that it'll go back down in size. So unless you have a goal for it, like arm wrestling, or just you have an obsession with having a bigger thumb, because keep in mind again that the majority of your muscle is located in this area, the rest is extremely tiny or non-existent, I don't really see the point at all. But not every gimmick is bad, and I think that the musculature of the jaw, even though it is being pushed by people who tout looks maxing and, in my opinion, give dangerous advice to young men, has still to be recognized as very important for aesthetics. So I'm going to place it in the jacked god category. Because when talking about exposure to the naked eye, what is more visible than your jawline? Unless you are rocking a shitty beard like myself, your jaw is always visible to people, that's what they see. And if you have a very nice defined jawline, it makes you look more masculine and more aesthetic by default. If you have no jawline whatsoever, it makes you look weak, it makes you look pathetic, and I guarantee you that no one finds it attractive. I've never met a man or woman in my life who told me, hey, you know what I really like in a man? It's when they have no jawline whatsoever. It's when they're chinless. It's when they look like a Muppet. That is what really gets me going. Never. It's never happened. So if you can find a way to hypertrophy the muscles of the jaw to make it look more square, that is going to be a net benefit for you. It also makes you look more intimidating, which is, I think, the reason why in grappler baki, all of the male characters have these like incredibly big jaw muscles. And that's somehow replicable in real life, but understand that it takes one, very good genetics, because some people just are born with a better insertion, or they're born with a jaw that is going to make it more visible. All of these models that you see on Instagram with the crazy jaw, they are one, super lean, because the muscle is super lean dependent. So take all of these looks maxing posts with a massive grain of salt. The guy that is promoting that method was attractive beforehand. Having a square jaw, yes, will make you look more attractive, but it won't magically transform your life. One muscle group that will, however, is the neck. Likewise, no discussion, I'm placing the neck in the IUT tier. Remember how I just told you that having a defined jawline is going to make a big difference in your facial aesthetics? The neck is this times 15. Experiences have been ran. If you take a man who is very attractive and you shrink his neck, he loses attractiveness like this. It's almost magical. And that is because the thicker your neck is, the more masculine you look, the more aesthetic the face looks in comparison. My standard personally is neck in line with your jaw. So when you're standing here, there should be a perfect line between the neck and the jaw. If you can go more than that and wider than that, you'll look more and more masculine, up to a point where you'll start to look like an ogre. And I know that, again, a lot of people seem to be afraid of this. Bro, I've been training neck for years and years. I'm at like 18 inches. I'm inches away from thumb status. You don't have anything to worry about. There are really only benefits that come with neck training. One, it makes you less prone to injuries, severe injuries. Two, it makes your face look less fat, because now the fat has a wider area to distribute itself. So if you're bulking and you're not training your neck, you're hurting your facial aesthetics. And then of course, it also makes you look tougher, because by association, men who tend to have a thick neck tend to be wrestlers, MMA fighters, boxers, and people who play rugby or American football. So even if you're like me, a dirty peasant who only trains at the gym because he's vain, you're still going to be confused for a guy who knows how to fight, meaning that you're going to receive respect that you clearly do not deserve because you can't back it up, but people don't know that. The only thing they know is you have a massive neck and so you look tough. And not just tough, it also guarantees that you're jacked. I've yet to meet a man who has a big neck and nothing else. Like a big neck and then like chicken legs and no chest and no biceps. That doesn't exist. The neck tends to be the last part of the body you start to hypertrophy, after the calves. So if this is thick, the rest of the body must be thick by default. But the opposite is also true. Nothing ruins a body more than a thin neck. Sometimes I see these natural bodybuilders, I'm like, damn, like amazing legs, amazing core, amazing shoulders, like shelf muscles on fleek. And then I look at the neck, a bird neck. I'm like, how does your head sit on this? How does it not fall off of your shoulders? And why did you not fix it already? It ruins the rest of the physique. It makes you look more weak. So you really, really want to isolate it. And please do not rely on the excuse of, I don't want to get sleep apnea. At this point, I personally believe it's a myth. What causes sleep apnea is weight gain. It's not the increasement of size in the neck. Neck circumference gains in terms of muscle mass for the neck is not going to increase your risk of snoring. It's not going to increase your risk of choking. What makes you choke is the fact that the fat tissue around the neck collapses the trachea, meaning that you cannot sleep. But the good thing with muscles is that muscles is sturdy. Muscles is the exact opposite of fat. It creates a structure. So if anything, training your neck is going to make you sleep sounder. If you don't believe me, give it a try. Talking about things that you should try. Have you tried isolating your calves? Really? How many sets do you do a week? 3, 6, 9? And how many weeks in a row? How many pounds have you put on your calf isolation work for the past 3 years? Can you even answer that question? I know you can't. Why? Because you are just like me and the rest of the lifting population. We know that calves are important, but they're so fucking boring to train that we never do it, and that's a mistake, because calves belong in the jacked god tier. Might be shocking to some because it's a meme at this point that no one gives a fuck about calves. No one gives a fuck about calves as a defense mechanism because 99% of the lifting population has small calves. So we've told ourselves collectively that it doesn't matter, but we're lying to ourselves. It does matter because the calves is the most 3D muscle of the leg. Yes, you heard me right. The one that pops out the most when trained and hypertrophied is the calves. If you've ever met a dude with jacked calves, you can see the calves through genes. That's how visible they can get if you put in the effort. And of course, if you're wearing shorts, that's where the eye is going to go. Because if you wear a short that's like at knee level, your quads are hidden. No one sees your upper leg, but everyone can see your calves and they look puny. But if they looked big, it would look impressive as fuck. And that's from the front and the back, because developed calf muscles are visible from the front. Irregardless of how lean you are, irregardless of if you flex or not. If you're lean, you're going to get those veins, you're going to get those striations. If you're fat, you're going to get bigger calves. So it's a win-win. And since the calves' function is to help you walk, you're constantly flexing the motherfuckers. So people can constantly admire them if they are huge. And that to me is the ultimate status symbol. Because it's the one muscle group that is the least developed in gym bros everywhere. If you are a gym bro with a muscular body, head to toe, including your calves, that is just putting you above the rest. But not every muscle of the lower leg is as important. There's another one that no one trains, and I think that it's not really a problem because it doesn't do much, and that is the tibialis muscle I'm going to place in the do you even lift tier. For the simple reason that it's a very small muscle. So even if you hypertrophy it a lot, the visual effect you get from it is not that relevant at all. I must admit, however, that it does look cool if you have that definition because it's like protruding from the side of the leg. So it can add to your overall thickness, but I would always tell people to isolate the other muscles of the calves first. That being said, I've started to target that muscle group in particular 2 weeks ago, and I must admit that the movement and the tibialis raise feels very cool. It's something that you can do mindlessly and it's actually quite fun. So give it a try and report back whether or not you believe it's important for aesthetics. And this is what I want to end this video on because even though I've placed certain muscles extremely low on my list, it doesn't mean that you need to neglect these muscles because at the end of the day, all of this is subjective. After all, your physique is a statue and you build that statue for yourself, not for anyone else's enjoyment. So don't hesitate to let me know in the comments which muscles you think are the most important for aesthetics and to look jacked. And I'm going to leave you with that again in the description. You have the most important muscles for hypertrophy that go with this tier list, and you have every single exercise tier list as well to pick from for your exercise selection if you want to create a training routine for yourself. If you enjoyed the video, remember to check out the coffee page. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.